Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. The U.S. House of Representatives has overwhelmingly approved a 3-year extension of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, preserving duty-free access to American markets for more than 30 African countries. As the bill moves to the Senate, attention is turning to eligibility conditions, with South Africa facing close scrutiny over its continued participation. Will the African Growth and Opportunity Act's extension translate into real industry growth for African economies, or will stricter eligibility reviews limit its impact? Ghana has paid a $1.47 billion to clear legacy energy sector debts, easing power supply challenges and restoring confidence across the power sector, and plans to raise 10 billion Ghana cedis through its first domestic infrastructural bond to fund roads amid improved economic conditions. What lessons can other African countries learn from Ghana on clearing sectoral debt, mobilizing local capital, and addressing economic challenges without deepening public debt? Uganda has cut internet access and tightened security ahead of its presidential elections, drawing criticism over repression as President Museveni seeks a seventh term. Could Uganda's electoral process be considered free and fair amidst the internet shutdown and a heavy security presence? Joining us today for further insights is Samuel Atiku, an economic analyst at SBM. Welcome, Samuel, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
It's always a pleasure, and this is our first pod for the year. Let's just kick up with our first story where we're seeing the US has extended its African Growth and Opportunity Act. And this gives Africa access to the American market. Um, from an economic standpoint, how significant is this extension for African exporters? And does the 3-year time limit provide enough certainty for long-term industrial planning? I know that this act has been in existence and now there's an extension. Just kind of give us like a brief of how it has been. Has there been an impact since we've had this act come into place and what the extension brings for it as well?
Oh yeah, thank you so much for actually the question. I think it's important to kick off on that note. Yeah. Happy New Year to our listeners. I think it's important to lay the context first. When we talk about trade with Africa, now Africa do trade with, I'll call it regional blocks across the world. You have the European Union, you have China, we have the Eurasia, depending on how you want to look at it. I'm talking about the Russian ambit. And then we have the United States on one part, and then we have the intra-African trade itself. Now, when you look at the trade between Africa and China, we are talking about something close to $300 billion annually. That's about, I think for 2024, it was about 296 billion or thereabouts dollars. When you look at the trade between Africa and the EU, European Union, we are talking about something in the threshold of about 355 billion euros, meaning that the Europeans are one of our biggest trade partner in Africa, and that's clear because of colonial legacies. Now, the biggest economy in the world happens to be the US. If I ask people questions, when you talk about the trade between the US and Africa, you think it's bigger than all this. It's actually a very tiny fraction. Talking about in the about 72 billion thereabouts. It tells you a whole lot story. And that was why the Bush government, in an effort to increase and improve trade with Africa, introduced AGOA. Now, the question is that our trade with Africa increase significantly? I don't think so. Because of certain things. If you look closely at AGOA itself, the concept, the construct around it says that, oh, for instance, your foreign policy must align with that of the US for you to tap into that AGOA. So there are a lot of conditionalities, and then I'll call it contingencies and all those kind of things, risk involved in actually putting and building your economy around the AGOA. And just to clarify also, AGOA is just a tiny bit. I would say it makes up about maybe about 30 billion out of about 72, 73 billion, it's about 32 billion. I mean, sorry, what am I saying? When you look at AGOA itself in terms of import, you are talking about 8 billion, which is very tiny fraction of trade with Africa. I mean, between Africa and the US. When I say talk about trade, I'm combining both import and export, so people don't conflict it as just export or import. Now, the big question, back to your question now. The question is simple. Will AGOA 2.0 have any significant shift in things that we experience? I don't think so. I think it's important, yes, for the US and Africa to continue to trade. US remains the biggest economy in the world, and it will make a whole lot of sense for Africa to begin to trade with the US. But if you look at the decision that has happened the last 1 year in terms of tariffs against Africa, I could give you a classical example. Nigeria, for instance, Nigeria import more goods from the US that we export to the US. And to shock you to know that despite that, you still have the Trump government actually slamming Nigeria with a tariff. And we've seen also based on certain things that were not grounded in evidence, tariff have been slammed on countries like South Africa and on like that. So, AGOA extension of AGOA is good, especially for countries that benefit significantly from that process. I won't say anything that encourage trade is good, but we need to be cautious of the fact that AGOA is just a tiny fraction of the overall trade with the US. And so the policy direction of the US towards Africa, for instance, blanketly just banning people from even processing visa, discuss. So it's a lot of things. I think there's no mutual respect between Africa and the US, which is unfortunate. It's not supposed to be like this, but it's unfortunate that that's where we find ourselves. And so, to your question, whether AGOA will have any significant impact and shift the needle, I don't think it will. It's good that we have it for people that are doing trade, especially for small businesses that continue to use AGOA, for people that are interested in the ferroalloys, people producing aluminum, people producing platinum, people that are actually into semi-processed metals. You could sell it to the US. That's good. The biggest exporters of that is South Africa. You have Mozambique, you have Ghana. So they want to see that continue to go, which is okay. But when you look at it overall, I don't think we're in a good place. So that I don't overtalk, but I don't think that AGOA 2.0 will shift anything significantly. I think America itself must look at Africa and understand that Africa as a market in the next 20 years will have the highest number of we have the biggest workforce. I mean, one in every five people working in the world will actually be of African descent. I don't know whether they will migrate or not, but based on the statistics and the projections we are seeing. So if the US uh, is pushing Africa beside and saying, no, I'm not interested in your trade and all those things, and then you continue to treat Africa as not a strong partner, and then you're making policy even without consultation, I'm afraid that people will continue to move towards Asia, towards China, towards the EU. And of course, in the future, I think it will come back to haunt the US, especially when everything settles down. I think that will be my take on this.
I mean, I agree with you. You know, you mentioned setting strict conditions that African countries must comply with. Your foreign policy must align with that of the US. And over time, we've seen US place tariff bans or basically increase tariffs. And now even South Africa is even trying to, they're trying to see how they can put certain eligible criteria. My thought is what or my question my question to you more like is What do you think Africa should do? Should we put more energy in opening larger markets like in Europe, China, and also, take advantage of the AGOA? Or do we look inwards? We have the African Free Trade Agreement, and I think that it hasn't yet come into place as much as we would love it. So can't we, what's your thoughts on us putting our energy rather than on, I mean, it's good to have larger markets, but we have a market here in Africa, and I don't think that we're exploring that enough as well.
Yeah, I think you're correct that Africa must look at itself. I mean, for clarity, inter-African trade is almost twice as big as our trade with the US already. Yeah, inter-African trade, when you look at the number for 2023, we are talking about almost 192 billion. So the trade that happens within Africa is bigger than the trade that happens between Africa and the US already. And just to clarify that. So it's there already. But we need to be careful that the question is that what kind of goods are we actually buying from the US? I think that's where the big question comes into play. And then the second thing is to look at the condition that the US is setting to be part of AGOA. For instance, you have to make sure that there's governance, right? Democracy is not backsliding. You have things like that. The truth is that those are principles, right, that are grounded in, I'll call it Pan-Africanism itself. When you look at the traditional African institution, they believe that governance must be trust. You have to have rule of law. You have to have political pluralism, making sure that you are not running one man state. You have to ensure that there are due process. You need to ensure that there are fair trials. There must be equal protection under the law. Those are fundamental principles that is grounded in, I'll call it even pre-colonial institutions of Africa. So yes, those are principles that we still adhere to. So if the US is saying that those are preconditions for you to actually trade with us, I think those are principles that we should hold dear as Africans. The second thing has to do with human rights violations, whether they are intentionally, whether we recognize the whole concept about human rights itself, and then are we not indulging, are we excluding people, or are we committing gross violation? The truth is that me and you agree with that, right? Human rights should actually, we must not violate human rights. Those are fundamental principles. When you look at the third one, it's about workers' rights, ensuring that you are not using children for labor, you are not cracking down on unions, you are not forcing, you are not indulging people in systemic, what you call systemic denial of labor laws, and then your triggering actions. Of course, we can raise question about Africa, whether we are aligning with those principles. The truth is that yes, those are principles that we hold here. We want that to happen in Africa. You can talk about corruption, which is subjective, and then the anti-corruption, or what Americans we call them anti-corruption, but anti-corruption enforcement. Are we working to ensure that we don't have corruption in the system? Those are the preconditions, right? Those are principles that we hold here in Africa. So, and they're not meeting the market-based economic expectation itself. Again, things around protecting property rights, things around limiting distortive state interventions, transparencies, regulations. Yes, again, you can ask yourself big question, especially if you're a student of libertarianism itself. Does it make sense, right, to be transparent? Does it make sense to actually ensure that when we are regulating businesses, we are transparent about it? You can see the whole, I think we talked about the Dangote, the whole thing flowing around recently. It tells you that, yeah, you have to be transparent as a regulator. You have to ensure that the state is not distorting things. You are not going to people's business and breaking it down because they disagree with you politically. Those are principles, again, that we hold here. And then I think the last one, I can go on, but just to summarize, barrier to US trade and investment. The truth is that Africa must protect our businesses, right? We may not, for instance, if X is actually used for circulating CSAM, that's child sexual exploitation material, I think the onus is on African leader to say we don't want this in our society. And you can say, yes, we don't want this. So if US wants you to actually continue to foster those kind of things, that raises a lot of questions, right? Um, then you can begin to talk about whether you're undermining US foreign policy. The question is that what is the US foreign policy? You also have your own foreign policy. In reality, you are not going to throw away a business. For instance, if a big substantial amount of people in your country is employed by the relationship you maintain with, let's say, China of the EU, but because the US foreign policy does not align with that, it means that because you want to do AGOA, you now kill 20 million jobs or something. That doesn't make sense. So there are question mark around those issues, but I can tell you clearly that some of the principles that were laid down in the conditions for actually aligning with AGOA are things that Africa would generally align with. Historically, the other issues like foreign policies of the US and then the barrier to US trade are historically what Africa will align with. But recently, the direction of travel of the United States, especially around their foreign policies and then their trade, is something that I struggle to understand myself. It's still not rational. It's not something you can pick up in a textbook and read. It's not something you read from colleagues. It's something that we are all learning about. But personally, if I were to advise African leaders on this, I would tell them, yeah, you have to make sure that your foreign policy also align to your own will, and then more importantly, also your trade with the world must be to your own advantage, not to the US advantage. So those are just the conditionality. So I end by just saying this, whether we like it or not. I mean, um, yes, intra-African state is, I mean, trade is big already. It's fragmented, but it is big, 192 billion. We can look at that and say, yes, let's expand that. Yes, there are potentials for it to expand, especially with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But that said, we have to understand that some of these conditions are things that we should ideally align ourselves to. And I will say, yes, some African countries could actually tap into AGOA as it were, but I know some African countries will not be able to. I think South Africa may fall into that group.
Hopefully, let's watch and see how it turns out. Moving on to our second story, we're seeing beautiful, I mean, success stories from Ghana. They've been able to pay off their legacy energy sector debt. What lessons do you think that other African nations can learn from Africa? I mean, they're clearing their sectoral debt, they're mobilizing local capital, and they're addressing economic challenges, and they're trying to do that without deepening the public debt. What lessons can we learn from that story?
Yes, I think it's good when you see that energy arrears and all those quasi fiscal deficit had actually been wiped out. I think one way or the other, those government liabilities, the one way or the other create what I will use the term macro instability so that I use it loosely. Um, so I think the foundation upon which you build any economic growth is actually to have a stable macroeconomic indices, ensuring that inflation is low so that income of people, once you create jobs, think of it this way. Once I get a job, I know certainly that I can feed my family. I know certainly that I can prospect to own a house, I can have a car, I can move around, my life is better off. So for every job you create in an economy, the life of that person is transformed, at least to a degree. Not only that, the person becomes a tool in the hand of government, especially for his fiscal activity, based on the tax that you take from that person. And so that's been the vein. So when you go to what I'll call it the Western economics call developed economy, again, there's subjectivity around this thing. We can reanalyze and call countries the way we want to analyze it, but I'll use those words clearly. What you will notice is that once you get a job and you are working in a stable job, you can have a house, you can buy a car, you can live maybe based on credit system. But the foundation upon which what these economic systems are built is to ensure that there's macro stability, ensuring that the fiscal activities of government is actually not eroding the faith investors, and then whether new investors coming into it or existing investor or even businesses operating, whether in a social, I'll call it in a social capitalist model, are operating in that system is not truncated. And one way to measure that is ensuring that the price of goods and services are not increasing arbitrarily. Inflation rate is actually keep at bay. And the way to keep inflation there is to ensure that the quasi fiscal deficit is near zero. And that is what we see Ghana doing. So the lessons there for Africa is that we need to address our foundational problem. You cannot build a house when you are standing on a sinking floor. You have to start building from a foundation. Imagine you are in a you are standing. How do you stand on a ground without floor? You will continue to sink deep. Exactly. So without those foundational issues, you will sink deep. The second thing is that the arrears, one way or the other, breaks the payment chain. Typically, you go from utility to fuel supplies to generator maintenance, and then you keep rolling around in circles. And then you pay debt, and then you keep going around in circles. I think what we've observed is that if you can cut that chain, break that chain, typically it allows you redirect your energy towards other things. So what I'm saying in essence is that we need to stop this unnecessary circle of, oh, um I get this. Don't let me go deep into this so that I don't start sounding too academic around all these things. But I think perspective, I mean, looking at this and putting everything together, I think it's one thing, this whole thing, the lesson we can learn is that for Ghana, what we're seeing is that it signals that there's a pivot towards local currency funding, which will so, I don't want to begin again. I'm drifting and then I'm going where I don't want to go. But I will say that the biggest lessons for us is that the foundation upon which you can build any economic growth is to ensure that there's macroeconomic stability. One thing the way to do it actually ensuring that your fiscal activity is standard, is stable, and that's exactly what you see Ghana doing, which is good for them. So the next few years, we see how that translates to improvement in terms of their foreign exchange exposure. We begin to see how that affects their domestic market, especially, and how it affects their capital market, how we change pricing architecture, how people estimate price, how it begins to change even their fiscal consolidation, things like what we call fiscal credibility itself, how investors look at Ghana and say, oh, these people are trustworthy. So let's see how that changes it. But I think it's a good starting point for Ghana. And then if you continue and you maintain this level, of course, things will change for Ghana going forward.
Really interesting. And now to our final story, where we're going to Uganda. They're having their elections, and I mean, 2026 is like an election year for a lot of countries. So Uganda is one of them. But we're seeing like something that we always see. It's like the what I call it African politician playbook where they shut down the internet. We saw that in Tanzania as well last year and many other countries. But now we're witnessing it in Uganda. Could Uganda's electoral process be considered free and fair when we have internet shutdowns and heavy security presence as well? What are your thoughts on this story?
Well, I would say seven things stand out when you look at the story rolling around on Uganda. The first thing is to think about it this way. Free and fair elections requires what I will call it, scholars will call process integrity and environmental integrity or environment integrity. So freedom of expression, association, the media, and equal campaigning. Uh, so what does the shutdown that you see, the intimidation that you see, does it promote environment integrity? Does it promote process integrity? I don't think so. I think it degrades the environment. It makes it charged up. It makes violence very easy to combat because people feel, using the word, people have this feeling. They feel this is not working in our favor. They feel cheated, of course. And then there's resentment in the air, and that could trigger violence. That's the first point. The second thing you see happening is the internet shutdown, just like you said. What does it do? Internet actually reduce the ability to verify. They say go and do this and verify later. In elections, you want to verify. So if I shut down the internet, it becomes very difficult for real-time check to happen. Yeah, it ensures that you cannot run parallel voter tabulation capacity, reduce the capacity of opposition and then the media, the independent media, and then the civil society organizations playing in there to run in parallel, to actually tabulate voters tally in parallel. And then it weakens documentation. And once you weaken integrity for verification itself, again, there's resentment in the air. You feel cheated, even if you are not being cheated. That's the second big issue that we're seeing. The third one is that there's current reporting If you look at the current reporting, I think it highlights delays and alleged irregularities already. You see things around technical failures. Remember Nigeria, remember Ghana, remember it's there. Yeah. What do you call it now? The BVN is not working. This is not working. Those technical failures, you see them already happening. You see accusation of ballot stuffing. You see heavy security presence. Those again raise a very classical credibility stressors. That's what we look at. You could look at the human rights groups themselves arguing that shutdowns are right violations and armed transparency. Of course, you look at Amnesty's statement around what is going on, and that again raises a red flag. Then you see the comparative evidence itself, whether shut down. And we could look at that, look at what watchdogs are saying, and then you try to find whether there are correlations or relationship between the patterns that have happened in other places, other clients. So my take here is simple and straightforward. There's a credibility risk to this election. There's a fiscal risk, there's a political legitimacy risk, there's a digital suppression risk, there's an external preference risk because definitely nobody's going to look at Uganda and see them as serious. And if you put all those things together, the direction of travel does not suggest that we are going to have a free and fair elections, and it doesn't suggest that the government of Uganda is ready to begin to change and begin to work to improve the life of the working poor and the have-nots in the state. And even if they are working, if their intention is to work in that direction, they do not have the legitimacy to do that and to take drastic action that will shape the course of the history of the citizens of that state. It's quite unfortunate that we're still talking about this. I'm sure folks in 1960 did talk about this. In 1970, they talked about it. 1980, they did talk about it. 1990s, they did. 2020s, right? Year 2022 YK, we talked about it. 2010, we talked about it. 2020, we talked about it. Well, now in the turn of another century, going to 2030, another decade, we are still talking about these same issues. It's quite unfortunate that this is where we find ourselves in Africa.
I mean, I agree with you. It's quite unfortunate. That's all for today. Thank you, Samuel, for bringing your thoughtful perspectives on the issues that we had discussed today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
It's always a pleasure. To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, like, share, and let us know your thoughts. We'd like to hear your feedback as well. For deeper insights into our work, visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. That's all for today. Thank you for tuning into the week ahead. Join us next Friday for more updates shaping the African continent.